Good afternoon. I hate to break into these conversations, and the reason we hate to break into these conversations is, of course, what the Global Philanthropy Forum is all about, is forging partnerships amongst you. And so I know that that's what you're up to, but we're going to have a punctuation point right now, and that is a really thoughtful conversation about ways to partner across sectors. You heard from Secretary Clinton on the topic. You heard from Sunil Shah on the topic. You will now hear a panel moderated by Matthew Bishop, whose book you've surely read, and if you have not read his book, we will remedy that very quickly. He is the American editor and New York bureau chief of The Economist. He will be talking to Jean Case, who is CEO of the Case Foundation, to Shelly of Intel Corporation. She is Vice President for Legal and Corporate Affairs and Director of the Corporate Affairs Group there. And then finally, you'll be hearing from Walter Isaacson, CEO of the Aspen Institute. So enjoy. Matthew, it's up to you.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon. Thank you for mentioning my book. And one of the interesting things about the experience of launching this book has been that we had this subtitle, it's Philanthrocapitalism, How the Rich Can Save the World. And the most common, I think, misunderstanding that I've encountered about the subtitle is that people think we're arguing that the rich can save the world on their own. As if you haven't got enough to worry about. But whereas, in fact, I think the thing that I was struck most by in writing this book was just how much it can only be done in partnership with, whether it be non-profits or business, or ultimately, I think a lot of the book ended up being about government. And the key word is leverage. How do you leverage those relationships effectively? And this point was brought home to me by talking to Bill Gates and having him say, we really are a tiny little organization, which boggled the mind at first. But I think once you understand the enormity of the ambition and the potential, the 3.7 billion he's giving away this year is a small amount unless used extremely well. I think there's also a lot of misunderstandings about these partnerships, public-private partnerships, that I hope we're going to be able to put right in this session. One of them we mentioned in the book is this incident in West Wing, and the one but last episode where this Bill Gates-like philanthropist approaches C.J. Craig and tries to persuade her to come and run his foundation. And she ultimately declines, but says, what you must really do is go away and build some roads in Africa. And I just couldn't think of a worse piece of advice that you would give to a philanthropist, is to go and actually build roads in Africa. So what we want to get in this session, I think, is a sense of really what the potential is, what the pitfalls are, where philanthropists really can make a difference in these partnerships, and where it may all go wrong. Now, I've always secretly suspected that Jane Wales runs the world. I think we've had final proof of it today, because in the last day, you've heard both from Hillary Clinton and from the new head of the White House Office of Social Innovation that their door is open and they want to hear about partnerships with you. And this panel is about the best placed group of people that you could want to explore the subject of how to walk through those doors and what to say when you come through. We're going to start with Walter Isaacson, who is actually in charge of the first organization that is part of Hillary's new initiative. So I'm going to hand over to you, Walter.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I'll mention your book, which is great, because I think it is a role that each of us should play, which is to mention your book before we begin to speak.
I won't mention it again.
There is also a role that's traditionally played at this forum, for those of you who've been here in the past, which is all the speakers and all the moderators draw a straw, and one of them gets the lucky straw that gets to say something nice about Jane Wales. And as the new partner of this forum, I preempted that process and said, I want to be the one in the middle of the forum to say how much we owe to Jane Wales for founding this organization. It is now more relevant than ever, so much so because we have a new administration, We have a new global crisis. We have all sorts of needs that we've been trying to address. And this idea of putting together partnerships, both public and private, as well as amongst ourselves, is what Jane is all about and is more necessary than ever. We at the Aspen Institute, and myself personally, I may say, are also greatly flattered to be a partner in this and also to be working as a colleague with Jane. So I think we're on to a new level for this. Particularly interesting, as Matthew said, was that the Secretary of State and Sonal Shah both talked about the needs for public-private partnerships in this administration. Jean and I have the great honor to be involved as chairs of one such organization, and I'd actually like to just drill down for 3 or 4 minutes and explain how it works, because in a meeting both before her talk here and then afterwards, and then with Elizabeth Bagley, who I know has been here a bit for this forum, we talked about how we can take what we are doing with the U.S.-Palestinian partnership and make it a template for other private partnerships that people in this room will try to do. Likewise, Sonal Shah has created a series of roundtables that Jane is helping to run at the Aspen Institute that just talking about social innovation funds and how they can be leveraged into public-private partnerships. The one that we have the privilege of, as Matthew said, being the first of the Obama administration and Secretary Clinton's public-private partnerships is actually a polite way of saying we're the last one standing from the Bush administration. They formed 3 or 4 of these. I think 3 of them at least imploded or didn't quite work. But Jean and I were a little bit too diligent. We actually did what they asked us to do and got very involved. And they were somewhat surprised because I think they wanted a photo op and they didn't actually expect a real public-private partnership. But we kept for 2.5 years continuing to do it as various undersecretaries of state came and went. But we continued this partnership, and people would occasionally look up and say, oh my goodness, you're still doing that. And what it is we wanted to do it with the U.S.-Palestinian partnership, both on economics and with NGOs, nonprofits, and social innovators. We also wanted to do it hand in glove with the Israelis because we felt that creating a civil society and a good economy that was interlinked between the West Bank in particular — Gaza was a little bit too tricky for us to be involved with in the past 2-3 years — and Israel would help lay the foundation for a possible peace. But we were not in it for the politics. We were in it to make life better and to give more opportunities for the Palestinian people, who certainly deserve that. So we did it in 3 or 4 buckets of partnerships. The first was mainly economic. We created a small business loan fund working with 7 or now 8 banks in the West Bank and the Palestinian territories that eventually spun off into being a somewhat independent entity called the Middle East Investment Initiative. Unlike what Dr. Yunus will tell you about, we did not feel that there was a need for microloans, nor did we feel there was a need for huge loans. We felt there was a need for those medium-sized loans that build small businesses. So we started with loans of $500,000 to $150,000, $50,000 to $150,000 for things like rug manufacturers, uniform manufacturers, garment makers, taxi cab companies. And it's grown so that we've now had in the loan fund a few that have exceeded $1 million. It is a partnership with OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which helps guarantee the loans. But we've raised money, especially with the help of Madeleine Albright, around the world, and from the Norwegian government in particular, to help fund this loan fund. Secondly, working with Tahina Abadaki, who is currently the Minister of Youth and Sport for the Palestinian Authority, and working with USAID, we have helped develop youth centers in 5 places around the West Bank: Hebron, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jericho, and Nablus, I think.
That's right.
And Jean has been one of the leaders in that one because USAID has helped build the buildings and find the properties, but Jean has been unbelievably relentless in finding I think Intel, Cisco, Google, Microsoft, various, I don't want to step on her thing. I'm going to let her tell you more about that. But it's just partnerships where private companies, NGOs, peace players, you know, basketball playing organizations can work together at a youth center so maybe we can compete in that world for the hearts and minds of a new generation. We helped create a business development conference. Most people who are business leaders in this country, if you say, go to the West Bank and see if you can do business, they think of people throwing rocks and shooting and that sort of thing. You say, no, no, come to Bethlehem. Stay in the Jafir Palace Hotel. Come to the new convention center. You'll realize Bethlehem is a really amazing town. And once you get business leaders there in a conference, and we had a conference that Booz Allen Hamilton helped us put together. It was a year ago, I think. Dr. Fayyad, the prime minister, was one of the leaders. It was eye-opening for people, and Gene has subsequently brought back at least one major delegation of business leaders going to the territories. There's other things we do, but I think I've used up my allotted time. I just wanted to say that we hope that this can be a template, whether it's working in Nairobi, working in the Palestinian territories, working in any part of the world where we need partnerships, because it leverages all we can do, and it also gives us a bit of humility where we're not just coming in and trying to impose ideas on a population.
Now, Gene, I mean, coming in as a private philanthropist to sort of rather to an area that's proven extremely difficult for the sort of best diplomats and politicians in the world to solve. I mean, what persuaded you that you could make a difference, and what have you learned so far?
Well, our foundation had done some work in the region for a number of years prior to being asked to serve in this role. And then when I was and realized folks like Walter and some other private sector leaders were going to be part of the effort, it was not a hard decision to decide. It makes total sense when you think about it. The peace process has been, for a long time, more politically led. And you know, it doesn't take rocket scientists to realize we weren't getting a lot of traction on that front. And the idea here was, as Walter said, gee, what if we could actually condition the economic environment more favorably for peace? And who really might be smart to lead that? Well, obviously that's the private sector, but obviously it's hand in hand with the US government, with Israel, and with the Palestinians. So it really was a pure public-private partnership. The thing that really has opened my eyes more than anything else before, and I'm so delighted that Shelly's on the panel with us because she is one of our corporate partners, is that when we began to reach out to corporate leaders in the United States and say, so we have this opportunity. You've seen what's happening in the region. We've seen what's happening in the region. We all want peace. Will you guys play a role? And what about, before I could finish the sentence, it was clear U.S. corporate leaders have a really strong appetite to play a role in the issues that matter, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. And so for me personally, as a private sector person getting involved, I realized, you know, a lot of these folks had never been asked. I mean, they were sitting there ready, willing, able to bring resources. And the mission in a nutshell is connect US private sector resources to the region to build economic development, as Walter stated. But so many corporate leaders with great assets, great talents, great networks and contacts simply had never been tapped to play a role. So I was really, really excited to see the strategy of using the private sector to engage the private sector and having them come alongside a government and co-invest in this public-private partnership. And we've seen some really exciting things take place. As Walter said, not only these youth centers, which Intel is providing all of the technologies there, Intel made a commitment to train 10,000 teachers in schools as well in the region, and working with the Minister of Education over there. I can't tell you what that means to the Palestinians when a US company steps up and says, here's what we're going to do for you. Cisco put in $2 million philanthropically and has agreed to invest $8 million more in small businesses in the region. Google goes and hosts a developer conference, trains small businesses on how to use their Google applications to grow their businesses. These are meaningful things that are producing economic opportunity and education equality and access really to marketable skills that just really have been missing. And they haven't really seen the US leaning forward from the private sector in this way before. So obviously, we're very bullish on this. We think it's a terrific example of what could be taken forward around the globe.
Now, as Intel's approached by philanthropists and by the administration and asked to participate in in this partnership? I mean, how do you decide as a company that this is something you want to do? What reassurances do you need? Do you use it as philanthropy, or is this something that's core to your strategy?
Well, I think this is a great example where we had some expertise from working in the region, but not particularly in the Palestinian territories. And this was a great way for us to apply what we already knew how to do and bring it to this project. So the youth centers are a great concept because we have a program, a curriculum that teaches youth to empower themselves. It's about capacity building, and it's a great thing that we can bring to the project along with technology. Teacher training is one of our biggest focus areas globally. We're doing teacher training in more than 50 countries. So again, it's obvious good use of our resources to apply it here in this project. So it didn't take us too much thought or time to make a decision because we have these assets and we're always looking for ways to leverage and use them better. So it was a great fit for us to just come in. I think the area where we're stretching ourselves now, where we haven't quite figured out what we're going to do, is we're looking at university relationships, exchange programs with engineering, and also hopefully starting some engineering business in the community.
So talk a bit more about, I mean, how Intel has got to this point where it is able to even be approached, and what did you, how's your company's journey been to that point?
Our journey has been rocky at times, to be honest, because Intel's culture is just get it done. And as all of you in this room know, working in partnerships, you have to kind of step back from that attitude and learn how to listen and find the opportunities where you can both be successful. I think what we've learned over the years is to really set clear expectations. You know, why are we coming to the table, and why are the other partners coming to the table? Historically, luckily for us, our founders said that we will make a difference and we'll give back. So when you have that on your badge, it makes life a little bit easier to get the job done. But when we really tried to scale our programs is when our eyes were opened. We'd been doing educational programs specifically focused on science, math, engineering, and teacher professional development for years. But Craig Barrett, our chairman, challenged us to go big. And he threw out a lovely number of train 10 million teachers. And we had been going along at a pace of a couple 100,000 a year. So when he said train 10 million, we had to learn a whole new way of operating. And really what we learned how to do was partner with governments around the globe. And now we're partnering with foundations and other NGOs to really scale and reach more people.
I wonder if I could ask a question on
Sure.
that to Shelly, because Shelly is the most interesting case of this and has really thought it through. My old friend Benjamin Franklin once said that the best thing is doing well by doing good, meaning helping your own company, but also doing good by doing good in the world. When you all are assessing this, when Gene comes to you and says, do this, it obviously helps Intel to get a set of engineers in the Middle East, in that region, in the Palestinian territories, to have Intel have a foothold there because you do already do so much in that region. Mm-hmm. So it's good for your business as well as for your social ethic. Absolutely. How do you try to tie those two together, or can you keep them separate in your minds? Or?
We don't want to keep it separate because we think that limits our capabilities. We want to harness all the power of Intel. So we have an Intel Foundation, and of course we abide by the laws that govern it. But we're also able to access corporate dollars to go beyond what the foundation might be able to do. So we've had an evolution where we were very separate at one point in our evolution, and now we've really decided that we can do the most good by doing what we're good at, which is what's our core capabilities as a company, and then tying that to trying to make a difference.
Now, can I ask you a question, Walter? The point you made about the previous administration was that this was the only partnership that really survived. I mean, from your perspective, why did your one work and the others not work?
Gene Case, that's a two-word answer instead of one-word answer, helped because of a persistence. I mean, Gene kept going to company after company, even just recently, because up until yesterday, when Hillary came in here, she said she wanted to talk a bit, and Jane was there. I said I need to get in a word with her, and then we started talking about how are you going to do these public-private partnerships, really? And so she got focused on doing it. Jean was somewhat frustrated because she has a couple of companies lined up ready to make announcements, and we didn't have, you know, Senator Mitchell's busy, and there's nobody quite yet confirmed for the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy, and we were being held up. But I think it takes a certain persistence, and as Jean said to me at lunch, you have to just keep raising it everywhere you go with people. There is nothing, with all due respect to anybody here from the U.S. government, more frustrating than dealing with the U.S. government. You know, you can spend, but OPIC wanted to do something, and so we started dealing with the OPIC. USAID said, oh, wait, we could use your help getting these centers developed. So eventually, if you're persistent and keep pushing on doors, 1 out of 5 pop open, and you find somebody in government who says, we have been really eager to get Intel into those youth development centers, and now we see how you can help us. Jean, can you help me on this?
Yeah, and I want to be careful that it's not sort of the mutual support society here, but I want to make sure that the audience understands the model at work here, because the model is really unusual. When President Bush and Secretary Rice put this in place, they turned to Walter at Aspen and said, will you guys be sort of the managing partner of this, which really enabled us to sort of design it and carry it forward the way that we wanted to, even though we had the credentialing of the White House and the Secretary of State. So it's very easy for Walter to say it was about me and my persistence, and thank you very much for the compliment. But it's important if you're looking at the model and you're going to replicate the model to make sure you know all the pieces that work. And I simply could not have done, nor would I say companies would not have done what they did without all of those pieces being in place. You know, we held things at the White House, we held things at the State Department, the Secretary of State and the President both spoke to this partnership. Walter and his relationship, Aspen and its very good team and management of this. It's a model that I really hadn't seen before in many, many years of working both on the government, corporate, and foundation side. And so I really do believe, Walter, that sort of this Aspen as the general manager, your involvement and, you know, having kind of the credentialing of both the White House and the State Department made a difference, and we believe we'll have that again. And you weren't supposed to say that we didn't know we were going forward until yesterday. But we're glad we are.
Now, in March last year, Walter, you wrote in the Washington Post that, you know, we have a perfect opportunity, but it will probably last no more than a year if it's not energetically nurtured.
That's right.
Now, a year on, you know, what did you do to really...
As a journalist, Matthew, you must know that one of the greatest sins is to go back a year and read a prediction. And I will, at some point, go back and find out what you wrote a year ago and which predictions you made. I thought that window was about a year. The window is trembling at the moment. We have a new government formed in Israel that does actually believe in economic development in the West Bank, which is good, as Prime Minister Netanyahu's government, but is not, shall we say, fervent in pursuing the peace process. We had the problem now with the Palestinian Authority after the invasion of Gaza. So at the moment, the window has closed a slight bit on peace, because even though I think the populations, 70% of the population, both in the West Bank and in Israel, would love a two-state solution along the borders that are close to what they agreed to at Taba or Camp David. You have two political leaderships that aren't quite ready to get there. So I think in the meantime, what we can keep doing is building up. I mean, the best way to get to a peace is to have a stable, prosperous West Bank, and for that matter, Palestine. Palestine includes Gaza and the West Bank. And I worry that if the window closes totally on a two-state solution, I read you all the time, but I still don't know what the alternative to a two-state solution. I don't see a one-state solution. I don't see a apartheid solution. I don't see any other solution. So we will keep following the persistence that Jean has set for us.
So in that context, though, I mean, I think certainly I found that people in business, people in philanthropy, they really want to know they're making a difference with their efforts. And I'm fascinated how each of you, going into this process, decided you were going to judge whether you were succeeding or not, and how you feel you're doing. Shelly.
Just to comment a little bit, I think most of the companies involved, I know Intel, Cisco, Microsoft, We have been involved in the past and have had the door totally closed on a project. So I think we all went into this with eyes wide open that that is a possibility. It's painful, and none of us wanted to see it happen in the past, but we did have that experience. So knowing that, I think we're all a little bit wiser about how to proceed cautiously, still trying to make the biggest impact we can, but realizing that there's conditions beyond our control. We're taking a risk, as we talked about last night, and we think it's worth it. And I think we'll all continue to try different avenues because it's so important to be involved. But I don't think we're naive enough to think that it's going to be an easy road. So we're ready for whatever might happen.
And Matthew, I want to say, you know, what Shelly said earlier is Intel has business interests in the region. And one of their, and I don't want to speak for Intel, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we heard you say this, Shelly. And any company that's a global company today needs experience. They need on-the-ground, real-world activities in places where they see the future of their business going. And, you know, largely growth for many of these companies, not just Intel, will take place outside of the United States. So I think that there is a strategic interest companies have to be in much of the developing world and much of the world where many Americans haven't been before because they know there are future market opportunities. And if you take a company like IBM, for instance, IBM launched something last year called the Corporate Services Council. And essentially, they said they would take 100 of their managers or executives and deploy them around the world. And their deployment would involve a year of working in the community, really with NGOs, focused on social issues, et cetera. Within weeks, they had 5,000 applications for that one-year deployment for 100 people. IBM's no fool. IBM knows when they send those people out to these places, independent of whether they can measure the impact on the social issue, which they hope to do through that, contribution, they know that when they come back, IBM will be a better, smarter, more informed company because they have people who've lived it, they've done it, they've seen the homegrown community, and they can bring that back to IBM, and that's invaluable. So if they can move the needle on a social issue at the same time, well, shoot, that's icing on the cake. So I think the business interests of corporate really plays a role.
But can I also, but Jean, as a philanthropist, how do you personally judge whether it's succeeding or not?
Well, I think it's important, and we've tried to do this in the Palestinian Partnership as well. I mean, we've been very clear that what we're trying to do is bring education resources, jobs, and economic opportunity. I think Walter can speak to this, but in the loan program, for instance, you can't build your cab company if you can't get a loan for a new cab. So the measurements there are pretty clear. I mean, you know exactly the impact that you've had. In the case of education, when we train 10,000 teachers because of Intel's kindness and generosity, we're going to know that those teachers are more equipped to go into the classroom, and we'll see over the long haul the economic benefit that's brought by that. One of the things that we're looking at doing is putting a call center in the region as well. We will know, we'll employ 500 Palestinians through that. Jobs matter. Have we not learned that in the United States in the last year? So there are very clear measurements that we're aiming toward here, but some of this requires, and I think Shelly was referring to it, and as a philanthropist we feel this too, you have the benefit of doing or having what we call patient capital. You really are in it for the long haul. You really are in it for outcomes, but you don't necessarily need to see outcomes in 12 months to feel good about your investment. You just need measurement and evaluation along the way.
Let me pick up on that because it's a core issue for everybody in this room, and I've heard it spoken about all day yesterday, which is people who spend a lot of time, as some should, talking about measurements of success and metrics and how do you define success in a step-by-step way. I come from a business in which Jean's husband used to boss me around quite a bit, and we had quarterly numbers we had to meet at Time Warner. Or AOL Time Warner, I guess I should say. I got out of that business. And I do think you can be paralyzed by worrying too much about every metrics of success if you're trying to do something risky. On some things, you can do it with a metrics. Every month, we get that loan fund report. We know how many loans went out, exactly where they went, how many got defaulted, how many problems there were. Likewise, how many teachers can be trained or jobs. Sometimes you have that. But in one bucket, you have this notion of measuring success in a careful, like somebody did on a PowerPoint slide way. And then on the other side, you have the two words I've heard from both sides of me, persistence and risk-taking. Sometimes you have to be persistent, sometimes you have to take risks when you're not sure what's going to work. The other time I've been very involved in public-private partnerships was when I was involved as the vice chairman of the Louisiana Recovery Authority after the hurricane. And with all due respect to a lot of people in this room, I could divide the foundations and philanthropists in this world into two types. Those who were tough enough to go into a situation where it was really unclear and the political leadership was a mess and the whole place was a mess and they couldn't say, here's the exact metrics of success we need and we're going to get out. And I'll give some examples of the good ones. I mean, Judith Rodin at Rockefeller said, we just have to go in there and get things done. And I won't name the bad ones, but there were some of them who kept calling me up and saying, well, you know, we haven't yet been able to measure the boom, 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 boom. And I said to one of them, you're right, you're a big foundation, but you're probably not adroit or tough or risk-taking enough to be involved in New Orleans. Why don't you just go back to Delaware and deal with there where you can get a government that can give you good risk-taking. We didn't get any more money from that foundation. But frankly, if you get too paralyzed by how do we measure success, you wouldn't have been in New Orleans for the first year after the storm.
One thing I'd like to add about success measurements for us is one thing we've learned along the path to 10 million teachers is we used to feel very good about the numbers of teachers, and now our entire wish is that the program is sustainable and embedded in the national or local curriculum. So it's great to get the numbers because it's something we can talk about, but our happiest moments and what means success to us is when the government of Ukraine says this is now our curriculum, China says this is my curriculum, Russia says, Ireland puts it in all the teacher colleges. If they kicked Intel out tomorrow and said, you know, we don't want you involved anymore, we'd be happy because it's capacity building and it's sustainable and we don't need to be involved anymore. So that's our metric.
Now, Walter, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you mentioned New Orleans and you've also obviously had the experience of dealing with the federal government in foreign policy. My sense was that, you know, when Judy went in and basically the analysis was that the government, local, city, state, federal, none of it was really working at that point. And the role of the philanthropists was almost to come in and bang heads together and shake up government and get them focused on the job. Whereas, I guess in the Middle East, Palestine, it's a very different situation where you're being brought in by a government that wants you to facilitate something for them. I mean, where do you think the philanthropist has the best
I think sometimes the
added value
philanthropists have to take risks.
Yeah.
In New Orleans, we were not able to get a planning process going. If I can say politely, FEMA did not have the most enlightened and smart leadership at that moment.
They were doing a hell of a job, though, weren't they?
And with all due respect to my fun mayor of the city of New Orleans, he wasn't exactly a long-range planner. Mm-hmm. And the governor, who was a very decent person, you know, paralyzed a bit. And finally, it was like, okay, to the Rockefeller Foundation, you come in, you start funding this, send Darren Walker. Judith Rodin had been a great done city planning as head of Penn. And she just took over the process, and all of a sudden, the unified plan came together based on their seed money. There are times when we are pushing, or Gene is pushing and I'm pushing, against governments that are doing too much. I mean, where we can't quite get USAID to do, I'll let Gene talk about it, but a venture fund she wanted. And, well, Gene, I'll turn it over to you. You were pushing for it. Yeah. I mean, it's an example of where government isn't quite bending to your ideas, but you have to compromise a bit.
Right, and I would say I think your question to Walter is a really good one because, and Jane, I also do want to do a shout out to you because obviously this is one panel on public-private partnerships, but it's been a continuous theme through this conference and a big part of the theme. And obviously it's the way forward, particularly in this economy. But I think it's really important when we talk about the public side, it's not one thing. Right? I mean, you talked about New Orleans. Well, the government in New Orleans is a lot different than dealing with the State Department or when we go over to Israel and we meet with their, that's a different story. So the public sector isn't like one, you know, homogenous thing, right? It depends on what level you're working. Are you local? Are you state? Are you national? Are you global? In some cases, are you sub-Saharan Africa, in which you've got, you know, 10 countries you're pulling together or 20 countries you're pulling together. And then on the private sector, the same is true, which is you have NGOs. you have the corporate sector, you have foundations and individual givers, and you have faith-based. So we like to say public-private as though it's two things, but it's actually really kind of mushy, if you will. But each has its own strengths and weaknesses that it brings to the party. And I think the point Walter was making is, you know, sometimes it's easy, and I'm guilty of this as anyone can be, to ask of one piece of that what really isn't in their strong suit, okay? What government is good at is scale and infrastructure and process. I mean, you know, what the private sector has, particularly the corporate sector, innovation, right? Risk-taking, you know, really disciplined business models to help you see where you want to go. As we talked about, foundations sometimes can be patient capital. NGOs will get you, you know, it's the last mile. They're close to those being served. And I think in our partnership, we've learned some hard lessons, I certainly have, about asking maybe a big entity to be in a role they're just not used to being in. I mean, the US government, you say venture capital fund, and they go, huh, what? But looking back on that, you say, you know, but that probably really wasn't smart, because that's really not, I mean, you almost have to bring them along. And, you know, there may come a point, because the economy is stretched, people are doing new things, they're open to new ideas that get us to new solutions. Maybe we'll actually see traction on a venture capital fund before we're done in this new world. But at the time, you know, USAID was just in no kind of structure to even consider that. And I just think we have to be careful when we say public-private that we don't just think we're talking about, you know, two buckets. There's a whole bunch of buckets in that public-private.
I'm going to open it up for comments and questions in a moment. I know there are microphones in the room. But I'm right, am I, Jane? I hope.
Microphones?
But anyway, I wanted to ask each of you sort of a few, what advice you would give, firstly, to philanthropists if they sort of think, yeah, actually, I want to get involved in public-private partnerships. What, you know, where should they? What are the do's and don'ts? Where are the areas to look, and where are the things to avoid? And then ask the same as you think about what advice you would give to Hillary Clinton or to Sonal Shah about where they can be useful in seeking out partnerships and where they should stay away. I mean, why don't we start again with Walter, actually?
Oh. I think it's nice to have a structure. I think that one of the reasons some public-private partnerships, the early ones, didn't work is nobody quite knew who was in charge. We kept persisting, and we're about to hammer out a real structure for ours, and they said, that's a great idea, and that should be a template for others. It's also, as Jean was nice enough to say, it's good to have an infrastructure, like base it in an organization, whether it's the Environmental Defense Fund or Aspen, to say, okay, we've got an organization with a, you know, staff.
I would add that, and I said this in the beginning, clear expectations, which I think is the root of most marital problems and everything else in life. But really spending the time...
Now there are a whole lot of questions and hands went up.
I've been married 26 years,
Okay.
I figured it out. But I think spending that time up front, really asking each other the tough questions. So when we're working with a government, you know, really being honest about what our expectations are and making them put theirs on the table. And for philanthropy, I think, what do you bring to the table that's unique? You're offering something to the partnership that no one else can bring. You have to be able to articulate that so that the private sector can hear you and leverage you and work with you well. And that's what I would encourage, is be clear about what your strength is.
Jean, one philanthropist I was talking about who's done a lot of work in Africa was saying that her experience has made her realize that she needs to pre-agree everything in advance about the scaling up of the project. So she won't put any money into a pilot until she's had a promise from the government that if the pilot works and this will be defined in this way and that, then the government commits to take it to scale on this timetable and so forth. Is that the sort of thing that needs to be done?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, you know, speaking from the Case Foundation standpoint, we pretty much don't make investments unless they're collaborative and involve multi-sector participation. And, you know, the reason for that is we've just seen the power of a bunch of people linking arms with a diversity of, you know, talent and assets that they bring to the table. It's really kind of common sense, right? But your earlier question that you asked, you know, which is what would you advise? I mean, it's really interesting because if we would have had this panel 6 months ago, I don't know if my answer would have been the same, but I want to say I think we all realize We're living through an historic time in so many ways. The new administration, the economy, you name it. And many of you out there are sitting on talents and assets that you own. And some of that's your own time, some of that's your network, some of that's your money, some of that's your pride. I don't know what it is. I don't know where you come from in all cases. But I can guarantee you that new ways are needed to go forward today, unlike it's ever been true before. We have leadership in our federal government and in many places across the nation, locally and at the state level as well, who want to hear ideas, who are open to new ways of doing business. And as a private citizen, I would have never dreamed I would have the privilege of, we've talked about this, right? Of working with some of the coolest people on some of the neatest things in the world. And if you're sitting there and you have good ideas about how you might want to collaborate, I invite you to find someone and take those ideas forward. And I'm happy, I'll be around this afternoon. If there's any perspective I can offer on, where you go or, who you go to, if you have some things that you'd like to consider in a public-private arena. And of course, if you want to bring your resources to Palestine, I'm really around. But seriously, if this is work that interests you, I would absolutely encourage you that no matter where you sit, there's a role for you to work with some public entity making a difference in a meaningful way. And it's needed now more than it's ever been needed before.
Great, I think we have a question in the middle. You say who you are as well.
I'm Holly Wise, and I appreciate the comments that you all have made. Hi, Jean. I just want to sort of take a little issue with the tone in some of the specific comments, which suggest that partnership work hasn't been done with the government very much in the past, and there are only a couple that have been successful. I founded a business model at USAID 8 years ago called the Global Development Alliance that brought forward hundreds of partnerships. Many in this room participated in them, and billions of dollars were leveraged from a whole variety of private partners, as Jean very well described, not just writing checks, but bringing forward a bunch of different kinds of assets to address global development issues. I like the last question that you asked, which was, what in particular do you want from the new administration? What particular do you want from USAID and from PEPFAR and from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, from the State Department, in terms of either where do you want them to put their money for partnerships, or what specifically is broken that you want them to fix in terms of going forward?
Before we do that, Holly, can I just say thank you for that? And I want to offer any apologies if we've made it sound at all like this is the first time we've been through this, because as you well know, I have tremendous respect for GDA, and we've done many things with them, including they were the first we came to in our Clean Water Initiative in Africa. So thanks for pointing that out, and humble apologies if I think any of us have said anything to suggest otherwise. I do think we feel like this model of the UPP is one that could be scaled around the nation, but it has gone forward before, and thanks for pointing that out. You guys want to answer?
And then you can come back and answer it as well, but start it the other way.
We've had good success with partnerships in the past. I think what feels different to me, honestly, is as I travel the globe and we're welcomed with open arms by governments all over the world who just sit down and say, hey, what do you want to do together? We have this need, you have this expertise, and they're just so open to ideas. And now in the last 102 days or so, our inboxes are filling up with that same kind of request from the federal government. And honestly, in the past, we haven't had that kind of volume of inquiry. And I know Sonal and I are going to speak later next week about some opportunities. But we just feel like it's a great opportunity. It doesn't mean anything in the past has been bad, but it's a new attitude and an openness to work together. So we're very much looking forward to it.
Walter, and where do you see the big opportunities for this?
Well, I think the best thing government could do would be appoint Sonal Shah at the White House to be head of the Office of Social Innovation. She's a fellow of the Aspen Institute, and I think she's cool and great and wonderful. And the other great thing to do would be appoint Elizabeth Bagley to be head of public-private partnerships at state, where we now have one office very empowered to deal with. So it's an enormous opportunity.
So, Holly, I'll answer it by saying, and you and I have talked about this before, I think that there should be clear channels that are understood by citizens, and particularly leaders of all sectors around the world, to say, if you want to jump in, here's a way to jump in. And there have been many willing citizens, both in this nation and around the world, that want to jump in. and wouldn't have a clue where to get started, and sometimes have really meaningful resources to bring to the party. And you know, I think if we solve that, and some of that is just awareness, and some of that is PR, but some of that is really creating the streams or the channels, as Sonal and Secretary Clinton made clear yesterday.
So Shelley, I'm just briefly had this moment where I channeled an Intel shareholder, hearing you say how delighted you are by all these great opportunities to be philanthropic in all sorts of parts of the world, and thinking, you know, the share price has been beaten up in the last year or two, the economy is a mess. I mean, are you really in a position to do this? And you know, are you seeing other companies that are sticking to this commitment on?
Absolutely, and I think the latest research that's been done, I know McKinsey's working on a new report that indicates the percent of shareholder value that is created by these types of activities is much more significant than the practitioners in the field would even have guessed. When
By these types of activities, you mean?
Social good, working on social issues, trying to solve world problems, getting involved in partnerships. It actually adds tremendous share value. So the research, you know, you can find research about anything, but I'd say the emerging trend is that is coming to the fore more and more. Let me just give you a real low-level tactical example. When we're going to build a new factory, obviously it's a huge investment, $3 billion minimum now. The price has gone up quite a bit. We first go in and work with the community to understand what are the hot issues, what might our factory do that's good, or what challenges would we face, and we immediately start working on strategies and action plans. That enables our factory to be built on a faster schedule, get our permits, not deal with public hearings where people are opposed to our presence. That is a huge direct business value. So we know at that very tactical level, we can demonstrate the value back to the company.
My daughter is a computer science major at college, and everybody there wants to work for Intel. It's the coolest company because of what you do and what people like you do.
And Walter's point needs to be underscored. What you will hear from CEOs when you talk to them today, and I hear this all the time, there's two compelling business case reasons that they do these sort of things. I talked about the IBM kind of strategic interest, but more importantly, this younger generation just doesn't see the world the way we've seen it. They don't believe that you have a work day and then you leave that work day and then you go live your life. They see much more of a blended world, and they're demanding from their future employers, and this is definitely true of the best and the brightest out there, that employers want to be part of their future. They're demanding that these companies play a role, and consumers made up from this young generation, what every advertiser wants. That consumer between the age today, 15 and 30, is saying, you know, I think if I'm going to buy water, or if I think I'm going to buy this product, I want to buy it from a company I feel good about because I know that they're doing something in this world to give back in a meaningful way. And I think that's really the business case that CEOs recognize today that really comes back to represent shareholder value.
Do you not feel, though, that this economic climate must change some of that?
I don't, and Matthew, you and I spoke before the panel. When I saw you in New York a few weeks ago, it was a gathering of 60 of the nation's leading CEOs, and the conversation was completely and totally about social good. And I said at the end of the gathering, I wish we would have recorded this, but of course it was off the record, because I think people would be blown away to realize corporate CEOs care as much today about the issues facing this nation, whether they be company issues or whether they be social, community issues, you name it, because they realize it's good for business. So it doesn't mean they're not focused on profit making or they're not focused on growing jobs right now and sort of what the main thing is, but they are as concerned as ever before and see themselves as a valuable asset to, you know, solving some of our nation's ills.
Shelly's boss actually answered that question not too long ago when he was in Washington, when Paul Ottolini came here and met with the president, but then had a conference where he announced the opening of some plants, but also some more social innovation. And also at the Aspen Institute, we're doing an innovation economy studies and conferences with Intel. And he said, now is the time you most need to do it, not least need to do it.
Right.
Absolutely. I'll just speak to our CEO last year. In a time when companies are stressed, a lot of corporations are not giving any type of raises this year, bonuses are cut. Intel, and our CEO drove this, decided to invest in our employees in a different way by allowing them to volunteer more and by writing checks to their favorite nonprofit. We had never done this before in terms of the check writing to the employees' nonprofit. Huge success. We had more than 1 million 3 hours, $4 million. But the employees felt so good. Yes, they're not getting a raise. Yes, they might have less money to spend in their department, but we never saw such an outpouring of support for our program as the employees just felt so good about Intel for doing that. So I think there's so many ways it adds to the bottom line.
Did Paul say, because I've heard Paul say, Walter, he thinks that's the best thing they've ever done, really, that was like the best decision they've ever made is to do that program.
We have another question.
Good afternoon. I'm Cameron Elahian, chairman of Relief International, and I wanted to make a couple comments. As difficult as it might be to work with US government, which it has been admittedly quite difficult, but we do have a number of projects with various groups, compared to what we had to go through to work with British government, with Finnish government, and especially with Japanese government in our different projects in different parts of the world. If you really want headache, you should try to deal with Japanese government after.
Or the Louisiana government.
And second thing, I believe it's important to be mentioned. With the new administration, we absolutely see a significant change, and it's so nice to see that we are being sought, and more is part of listening on their parts in few meetings that we have had. I had the chance half an hour last night to talk to Elizabeth Bagley, and it was so refreshing to see the new approach, new ways that things were coming along. So I believe we are all for a very pleasant surprise.
So what do you particularly want that's different from this administration?
The things that bothered me from previous situation were at times there were all sorts of strings attached if they wanted to cooperate and provide some funding in whatever we were doing. There were some things that had significant political agenda attached to it that at times would actually make a non-political, non-religious philanthropy activity to be tainted. That was a big problem, and at other times it just created headache for us. So we had a project in Iran, and when the previous administration went and announced that they have approved $80 million to bring democracy and regime change in Iran, a lot of our people who were doing work over there were arrested. I mean, not only the administration previous one did not help, it created more headaches into what we were doing in some of the countries. So with the new one, we haven't seen that, but it's too early right now. Of course, any government has some significant interest and has got to do things that benefit America, but one can combine doing good and doing well together rather than being purely driven by political things.
Thank you. There's a question right at the back.
My name is Walid Harib. I am the executive
The
director.
mic is, okay.
My name is Walid Harib. I'm the executive director to Zayed International Humanitarian Award. I listened to the issue of Palestine and the related issue. And I think I have some sort of example to share with you. In the case of Darfur, for example, we wanted to do something. Everybody knows this current situation there. So what happened, due to the fact that we have the know-how, we have the contact and the ground, we are able to work with some international NGOs in creating that link. The same thing when it came to Gaza, we understood that we had difficulties to go to Gaza. So as a result of that, we understand that our main objective is not politics. Our main objective is to help the people on the ground. So for that, we went and we worked with certain MSF and others who we worked with them to achieve our objective, and we have achieved our objective in ground. My main question is philanthropy is the first element of the cycle. What comes next is the implementation in the ground. And one element I feel that a lot of times even our money is not used properly because of the implementation and the coordination element that it happens in the ground. So this is an element I feel we would like to have better coordination. American NGOs, American Foundation, they are doing a great job. We are coming here to learn from their advancement in the foundation element. But we would like to have more coordination in ground. That's where you get your money worth it, and your value for your money. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's a couple of interesting questions that come out of that. I mean, one is, working with organizations on the ground. Another, I think, is the question of whether, given there's just so much duplication and so many competing NGOs and philanthropists out there, governments even, can you actually coordinate the process and make it much more efficient? But why don't we, who'd like to take either of those questions? Walter?
It's very important to work with people on the ground, and to pick Gaza, for example, we really did want to show that we were doing certain things in Gaza, even though it was difficult. We worked for our loan fund through 7 Palestinian-owned and operated banks, and we also had CHF, which many of you know, which is I'm not sure it's a non-profit. I think it might actually be a company that does, helps put on the ground services and put things into place. It's difficult, but the good thing is by working through people on the ground who are from the area, you learn as opposed to try to say, here's the way we do things.
Yeah, I would say a great model we're seeing emerge, it is a public-private partnership, is in the area of malaria. And I think it's a model that will be studied for many years to come. You may know that the UN has a special envoy for malaria, and when that job was appointed last year, really he took a very strategic framework approach, and he went out to all sectors, the NGO community, the faith community, corporations, governments, et cetera. And he devised sort of what the needs and the challenges were, and he helped these groups understand what piece of it they were going to take toward a shared goal. And that sounds really simple, but as we all know, in working in and around philanthropy and around social issues, harder than you think. But it really is one of the first times I've ever seen, certainly on a global scale, but maybe anywhere, truly a strategic framework so everybody understands sort of the piece where they fit in and the role that they have to reduce overlap, to reduce everybody kind of getting in each other's way.
Because, I mean, the extraordinary thing about that coalition is just how diverse it is.
It's
and how many different, I mean, you've got the National Basketball Association, you've got Rupert Murdoch, you've got Rick Warren, you've got the World Bank.
And tomorrow they'll have their 3rd summit here in Washington, D.C., and it is remarkable. Talk about measurement, the traction they're making, where we're seeing malaria reduced by as much as 80–85% in some of the countries where they're deploying now in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think that really is one I would advise anybody who cares about this overlap issue and how to frame things and get groups working together collaboratively to follow that carefully.
Walter, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, it's because I don't really know the answer here, which is I've seen it where 25 different organizations all working in Palestine to do various things. And should we spend a lot of time trying to coordinate them and get them together, or is 25 flowers blooming a better approach? Jean is very good at bringing people together and making connections, and she has a lot of energy for that. Sometimes I worry that we spend so much time, not in our group, but trying to have summit meetings and umbrella organizations and coordinating groups that we're wasting half of our time trying to coordinate with 23 organizations, each doing wonderful stuff. And even though there might be some overlap, it'd be just great to have everybody go out and start basketball leagues on the West Bank, even if they don't overlap with the other basketball leagues. And I think that's one of the tough problems in the NGO world is how much time do you spend trying to coordinate every NGO, and how much time do you spend saying, that's actually spinning a lot of wheels, we should just all be working? And I don't know the answer to that one. So it just a wonderfully interesting question that I've noticed over the past 5 years as I've become more involved in this.
I think another nuance in the question perhaps was about the local capacity of the local organization and are they effectively using the money. One way that we've had success is, because we do partner with a variety of organizations in every community, is bring them together outside of the project to learn from each other about best practices, the proper way to account for their money and leverage their dollars. And that's something we want to do more, because we find that learning from each other when they're working on similar projects but in different regions of the world, that has a great potential to improve the whole field.
Do you ask that or do you require that?
Right now, we ask it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We tried requiring that in when we were, tiny baby organization 11 years ago, which we still really are, but, and we learned real fast, it's hard to require that. You have to have it be something that people want to do. You can't tell them they have to do it.
Good question there.
Thanks, Matthew. Excuse me. Roy Jacobowitz from Axion International. I'm wondering what your experience and what your thinking is in regard to sustainability, long-term sustainability of these projects. One of the cliches about public-private partnerships and government work is, something comes and then it goes. So the question is, to what extent do you think it's important, and at what moment in the development of these partnerships do you think it's important to begin thinking about the long-term survivability of partnerships?
I think you have to start thinking about it before you start thinking about it. So before you do anything, that has to be the first thing on your mind, is how will this be sustained? Because we've learned the hard lesson of projects that are great ideas and are impossible to sustain. So going into it, that's one of the first questions we ask ourselves in the planning phase. And we have to have a very good answer. And as I was speaking about teacher training, sustainability in that program is really about embedding it in the system and hopefully improving the system along the way, but that's our goal there. And so each project is a little bit different on what sustainability looks like, but it's fundamental at the beginning, not in the middle and not anywhere else in the project.
As slave to fashion, I went on Twitter before I came over here and asked if anyone had any questions about this panel, and one that I got back was ask them about things that they've been involved in that failed. And a couple of examples were offered. One actually was involving Intel and the one laptop per child controversy of a couple of years ago. I just wondered if you'd talk a bit about what you learned from that whole experience.
I'm not sure we really entered it with the right expectations, and I think that's why I wouldn't say it failed. It continues on today, and a lot of good has come out of it. But it was definitely an experience where the expectations weren't clear on what our role was in the beginning. And so it wasn't a huge failure because it happened very quickly. So that made it less painless. I'd say another lesson we learned was we started a project with the Boston Museum of Science, MIT Media Labs, called the Intel Computer Clubhouse. Going into that project, which was in 1998, I believe, we had this hysterical belief that we would fund each club for 3 years and then they would become self-sufficient. It sounded so nice on paper. And we thought we had a good process to choose organizations that could sustain beyond our funding. We very quickly learned, probably about year 2, that most of them could not sustain without significant more resource input. And then we had to change the whole model and look for a lot more partners. But that was a great learning experience for us. Now today there's still over 100 clubs, but a number of them have failed because the organization that we partner with could not sustain them.
Okay, and Walter, one of the things that, I was talking to some people about the problem of Palestine and how to help there. And a number of philanthropists last year said there was this greenhouse story where a whole lot of greenhouses were built
in the middle of
and
it.
then they were broken up. Can you just talk about what you learned from that whole experience?
Yeah, let me talk about the experience. Right before we started the U.S.-Palestinian Partnership, but it was part of the Aspen Middle East Strategy Group, which got us into the Palestinian Partnership, was when Israel was withdrawing from Gaza, there was something the governments couldn't do. Israel had all the greenhouses, huge amounts of greenhouses that were a backbone of the Gazan economy that they had built there, that Israeli settlers had built there. They were willing to sell them to the Palestinians. The Palestinians, for reasons you can understand, weren't willing to pay money to the people who had occupied their land and built things, and so weren't willing to buy them. So the Israelis, for reasons you may or may not be willing to understand, said, okay, we'll just rip them all down. This was not good for anybody, and it was something no government could easily solve, but normal private side people could easily solve it. So Jim Wolfenson, Lester Crown, who very much part of it, came and decided they would help put up the money, buy the greenhouses, and then donate them to the Palestinians, and everybody would be happy. And they needed a nonprofit doing work in that field, meaning the Aspen Institute, to be the middleman. So for one day, we at the Aspen Institute owned a large number of greenhouses in the Gaza Strip and even got pictures of all these wonderful tomatoes being grown. Mort Zuckerman gave interviews about how he had given the money to help do this. Everybody was moderately happy. The greenhouses were turned over. And as Gaza disintegrated somewhat and Hamas took over, most of the greenhouses were, you know, the copper pipes were taken out of the irrigation systems and fell apart. That's the tale, and it ended up getting us into a U.S.-Palestinian partnership to make things work better next time. I'm not very good. I don't know what the lesson I learned from that was, except for I did have dinner with Wolfenson about 3 nights ago, and he was still so proud of it that he had done it, so I just figured, oh, what the heck, you're going to win some, lose some.
Did you tell them they broke it or not?
I actually have wonderful pictures of tomatoes we put in the Aspen magazine. I don't know. I'm not good at the lessons learned part.
Okay, well, we're going to have one more question, and then I'm going to come back and ask each of you to finish by just throwing out a challenge to the audience to say, you know, where's one area that you think now we have this administration that wants to do partnerships, you know, that you could see something exciting happening that's not been tried before? So the last question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Marcello Palazzi from Costa Atlantic, working in foundations in the Netherlands, Sweden, and Denmark. I have a general comment and a question. General comment is public-private partnerships have been around for many years. I started my own foundation 20 years ago. Public-private partnerships have been a strip of influence.
The mic isn't working.
And the question, the point is, now that our governments have been promising a lot of new public sector money, come into account about what we do now, what we plan to do now, what we need to be able to ensure that the public money that's being devoted in the next few years to deal with the crisis is spent very differently from how we spend in the past. Much more about public-private partnership, much more about social enterprise, and philanthropists have a role to play in would be catalysts for this. So I would like to share this question with you. What can we do about ensuring that this money is not going to be spent in the same sort of bureaucratic, top-down way, very centralized, as has been the case in the last 20 years?
Jean?
I have trouble hearing.
I think the question is, there's a lot of extra public sector money being thrown at various problems at the moment. How do we make sure it's not spent in a bureaucratic
Shelly
way?
has the answer.
I don't have the answer, but one answer is we thought about this a lot as the crisis was unfolding and we began to believe there would be new investments. And one answer, which will sound self-serving, but it's a very long way from self-serving, is we believe the broadband access needs to be built out to give access to so many more millions of people. And so our message to government around stimulus is if you're going to build a bridge, if you're going to build a road, also let's build out broadband. So let's try to spend our money for the 21st century. And because we truly believe that access to the internet will enable so many more people to join the economy and also enables education. And so we might be accused of self-serving, you know, that's a long way to sell a computer, but okay.
But it is a good way to do well by doing good.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, if some of the money goes towards promoting transparency and research and reporting, as well as just going straight into projects, that will also help us to really make sure that we know. You know, I think it's good that Gates is now starting to put money into researching how they give the money away, and I think that should be something that happens with the government as partnering as well. But I want to finish with this last question to each of you, and start with you, Shelly. I mean, where
We always start with Walter.
I know. I think
I thought that was a rule.
he's exhausted by that. Look, it's terrible. Is there one area where, you know, if you hear these great pronouncements by Mrs. Clinton and by the White House Office of Social Innovation, was there a thought that popped into your head that if I wasn't doing what I was doing now, this would be a great opportunity to do something that hasn't been tried?
Well, one thing that we personally are very excited about has just been the president's hammer on science and math education. for the United States to remain competitive, to innovate, to be the country we're all proud to live in, we have to get serious about it again. So our chairman has been singing that song for a good 10 years, pounding the table, and now to hear it coming out of the White House in such a forceful way, I think it's a great opportunity. Now, we can't let it pass by. We all have to get very smart about what is the best way to invest in pure research, best way to invest in teacher capacity, which is the key in K-12 education to enable more math and science experts to go into the classroom. So we're very excited about that. It's great to hear, and I think it's a huge opportunity.
There are many possible answers to your question I could give, but I want to build on the one that Shelly just talked about, which is focusing on education and even teachers. I have the great fortune of the past 10, 15 years of working on the board with the best social entrepreneur I've ever met, Wendy Kopp, who formed Teach for America. And I look at that model that keeps scaling up and scaling up. And I think, okay, Intel wants science and math teachers.
Thank you.
You can endow a whole bunch of Teach for America science and math teachers to go into special places. In New Orleans, when we needed help, the public-private partnerships we built that worked were the ones on education. Help us with the school. Likesline, you're a shipping company, help us with the maritime school and help train teachers. We took the Teach for America model and we created Teach for New Orleans as well. We're doing that, I hope, in Palestine with the State Department, a Teach for Palestine. But we're doing that with Intel, which is Intel is creating learning centers in the Palestinian territories. If I were to pick one fertile ground for public-private partnerships with Arne Duncan as Secretary of Education, with this administration, with people around the world, it would be every company and every NGO could say we could take a slice of the most important economic, social, and political issue facing the world today, which is educating the new generation, creating a new generation of productive people who can be engineers, math, science, or for that matter, in the arts or anywhere else, and say, our company is going to partner with a school in New Orleans. Our company, Intel, is going to partner with Teach for America to get math and science teachers, or in Palestine to create learning centers. And I just think there's so many fertile opportunities for public-private partnerships in schools and in the creation of better teachers.
Jean, lastly.
Well, it's hard not to agree with that, but I think the question was, what would we sort of throw out maybe as a challenge or whatever. If you're in this room today, chances are you have a depth of experience with public-private partnerships. I actually was going to ask the audience that question earlier and didn't get the chance to. And we've tried to learn from the experience of others. If you've done something that you think is effective, make sure it gets daylight. This administration is wanting, that kind of a spotlight on things that have worked. If you've done it, to this, bring it to scale if you can. Find partners, contact people that you think can help bring it to scale. If you have a good idea, but you're not collaborating to bring that good idea to life, collaborate, try something, take a risk. And we're not embarrassed by the failures. The question came up, and I think there's no one out there doing smart things who hasn't failed. Take a risk if you're not taking a risk today, to try to bring a new good idea to light, depending on where your passion is.
And if I could just add to that, my own challenge, it seems to me this is a great moment for scaling things up much faster than I think anyone in the nonprofit world had imagined would be possible. And I think, actually it would be very helpful for everyone here to think, what's the one organization I work with that I really think, or that I know of, that we could really take to scale in a dramatic way? Think sort of scaling that happened with Google over 10 years, and do that in the nonprofit world. And maybe find some other philanthropists in the same area and see if you can all agree on the same organization and try and actually promote that as a candidate to be scaled. So I'd like to thank the panel on behalf of the Global Philanthropy Forum for providing such a stimulating conversation.